8 years ago, their albino twins were abducted while under their nanny's care, leaving both parents devastated and searching for answers. Authorities suspected the worst given the children's rare condition, as albinos were often targeted by traffickers for their distinctive traits. Over the years, as no new leads emerged, hope began to fade for everyone involved in the case. But then, one Sunday during a church service, the mother and father saw something shocking, something that would change everything. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The soft golden light of a Sunday morning filtered through the sheer curtains of Adama Keita's modest living room in St. Louis, Missouri. At 45 years old, Adama had grown accustomed to the quiet solitude that filled her home. But today, that silence was broken by the urgent tone of her own voice as she spoke into the telephone. "Yes, officer, I understand," she said, her fingers absently tracing the worn fabric of her armchair. "But this neighbor, her threats are escalating. She said she would burn the witch house, my house." Adama's voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to contain. The officer on the other end of the line assured her they would visit the neighbor and issue a warning. Adama nodded, even though she knew the gesture couldn't be seen. As the conversation wound down, a familiar ache bloomed in her chest, the ever-present pain of loss that had been her constant companion for years. "Wait, please," she interjected, stopping the officer from hanging up. Then, steadying her breath and tone, she added, "I know I was at the station just last week, but are there any updates on my missing sons?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken apologies and dwindling hope. When the officer finally spoke, his words were gentle but empty of the news Adama so desperately longed to hear. "I'm sorry, Ms. Keita, there are no new leads at this time." Adama thanked him softly and replaced the receiver in its cradle. For a moment she remained motionless, her hand resting on the phone as if it were a lifeline to her lost children. The ticking of the old clock on the mantel seemed to grow louder in the ensuing quiet, each second a reminder of the time that had passed since she had last held her boys. "My baby boys," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you're somewhere out there. I will never stop searching for you." With measured steps, she crossed the room to an antique dresser that stood sentinel in the corner. Its dark wood was worn smooth by years of touch, each scratch and dent a testament to the history it had witnessed. Adama's pale fingers, stark against the deep mahogany, traced the outline of the top drawer before gently pulling it open. Inside, nestled among faded papers and forgotten trinkets, lay a collection of photographs. Each one was a window to a happier time, moments frozen in glossy paper that Adama clung to with all her heart. She lifted out a family portrait, its edges softened by years of handling. There they were, captured in a moment of perfection. Herself, her ex-husband Elliot, and their twin sons, Amari and Ibrahim. Adama's throat tightened as she gazed at the image, remembering the chaos of that day with a bittersweet clarity. "You little monkeys," she whispered, her finger tracing the outline of the boys' faces. "It took us longer to get you dressed than it did to take the picture." The memory was vivid, the boys' laughter echoing through the house, Elliot's exasperated sighs as he chased them with combs and clean shirts, her own determination to capture this moment of family bliss. Now looking back, she wished she could have frozen time itself, keeping them all safe and together in that golden afternoon. Tears welled in Adama's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. She set the family portrait aside and reached for another photograph, this one of herself, much younger and radiantly hopeful. In it, she stood before the Statue of Liberty, her face alight with the promise of a new beginning. The contrast between that younger self and the woman she had become was stark. Back then, newly arrived in the United States in 2014, she had felt invincible. After years of fear and hiding in Africa, where albinos like herself were hunted for their body parts, America had seemed like a sanctuary. Adama's mind wandered back to her childhood, the endless moving, the cautionary words of her late father about the perils lurking in every village. She could still hear his voice, urgent and hushed, speaking of the hunters, men who preyed on albinos, selling them either into slavery or to village priests for rituals. "But we escaped all that," she whispered to her younger self in the photograph. "We found safety here." And for a time it had been true. She had met Elliot, fallen in love, moved to Missouri, and given birth to 2 beautiful albino boys. For 2 blissful years, they had lived the life she had always dreamed of, happy, secure, and free from fear. But then came that fateful night, the date night with Elliot, leaving the twins with the nanny they had trusted. Returning home to find the boys vanished without a trace, the frantic searches, the endless investigations, the hope that dwindled with each passing day. Adama's fingers tightened on the photograph, crinkling its edges. The pain of that loss had torn her marriage apart, leaving her and Elliot as broken as the family they had once been. With a deep, shuddering breath, Adama returned the pictures to the dresser drawer. Her gaze lifted to the cross and rosary that hung above, silent witnesses to her suffering and enduring faith. "Lord," she began, her voice barely audible, "please watch over my boys, bring them home to me, and give me the strength to keep believing, to keep searching, no matter how long it takes." As she bowed her head in prayer, Adama felt a familiar mixture of grief and hope wash over her. It was a feeling she had come to know well over the years, the ache of loss tempered by an unshakable belief that someday, somehow, her family would be whole again. The soft chime of the clock signaled the end of her prayer, a quiet reminder that the world kept turning, even as her heart remained trapped in that moment of loss. With one last lingering glance at the dresser and its precious contents, Adama turned away. Suddenly, the shrill ring of the telephone cut through the quiet of the house, startling Adama from her moment of reflection. She hurried to answer the call. As she picked up the receiver, a familiar voice filled her ear. Elliot, her ex-husband. "Adama, I've been trying to reach your cell phone," Elliot said, a note of concern in his voice. Adama's free hand flew to her forehead as realization dawned. "Oh, Elliot," she replied, suddenly remembering their planned meeting. "I'm so sorry. I left my phone in the bedroom. There was an incident with the neighbor this morning, and I've been distracted." She could hear the shift in Elliot's breathing, the slight intake of air that signaled his rising concern. "The neighbor again?" His tone sharpened. "What happened this time?" Adama sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. The cool surface grounded her as she recounted the morning's events. "She threatened to burn my house down, Elliot, called it the witch house because I'm an albino. I had to call the police." "Damn it, Adama." Elliot's frustration was palpable even through the phone line. She could almost see him running his hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar from their years together. "How many times have I told you to move out of that place? It's not safe for you there." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with concern and a history of similar conversations. Adama's fingers traced the patterns on the countertop, her voice softening as she replied, I know, but this house, it's all I have left of our life together, of the boys." A heavy silence fell between them, laden with shared grief and unspoken regrets. When Elliot spoke again, his voice was gentler, tinged with the understanding that came from years of shared pain. "I understand, but your safety is more important than memories, Adama. You know that, right?" "Yes," she whispered, though her heart rebelled against the very thought of leaving. Elliot cleared his throat, changing the subject. "Anyway, I was calling about our meetup. Are you still coming here?" Adama glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands seeming to mock her forgetfulness. "I'm so sorry, Elliot. With everything that happened this morning, it completely slipped my mind. Can we still meet?" "Of course," Elliot replied, the warmth returning to his voice. It was a warmth that, despite everything they had been through, still had the power to comfort her. "How about we meet at our usual spot in 15 minutes? It's about halfway between us." "Perfect," Adama agreed, already moving towards her bedroom to change. "I'll bring the latest reports I've received. Maybe there's something we've overlooked." As she hung up the phone, Adama felt a familiar mix of hope and dread settle in her stomach. These meetings with Elliot, once a source of comfort in their shared grief, had become bittersweet reminders of all they had lost. Yet she clung to them, to the possibility that one day they might uncover the clue that would lead them to their sons. In her bedroom, Adama quickly changed her clothes, selecting a modest blouse and skirt that covered most of her pale skin. Even after years in America, she still felt the instinctive need to protect herself from unwanted attention. She gathered the police reports and various documents she had accumulated in her tireless search for the twins, tucking them into a worn leather folder. As she stepped out of the house, the bright sunlight made her squint. She fumbled in her purse for her sunglasses, her albinism making her eyes particularly sensitive. It was then that she noticed something tucked under her car's windshield wiper. With a sense of foreboding, Adama approached her car. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze like a trapped butterfly. She plucked it from beneath the wiper blade. Her breath caught in her throat as crude lines formed the unmistakable image of a limbless figure, hovering over what appeared to be a bubbling cauldron. Adama's hands trembled as she crumpled the offensive drawing. Her eyes darted up and down the street, finally landing on a figure several houses down, the old woman who had been tormenting her for weeks. The neighbor's gaze was filled with a mixture of fear and hatred that Adama had seen too many times before, both here and in the land of her birth. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Adama tossed the crumpled paper into a nearby trash bin. She wouldn't let this latest act of cruelty deter her. She had a meeting to attend, a purpose to fulfill. As she slid into her car and started the engine, Adama silently prayed for strength, not just to face the challenges of the day, but to continue the seemingly endless search for her beloved sons. As Adama navigated the familiar streets towards the cafe, her mind churned with a tumultuous mix of emotions. The incident with her neighbor had left a bitter taste in her mouth, rekindling memories of the persecution she had faced in her homeland. It was a cruel irony that even here, in the land she had once seen as a sanctuary, she still encountered such ignorance and hatred. If only she knew, Adama murmured to herself, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. If only she could understand the pain. But as quickly as the anger rose within her, Adama felt the cool touch of her cross necklace against her skin. It was a constant reminder of her faith, a tangible connection to the beliefs that had sustained her through her darkest hours. Taking a deep breath, she consciously relaxed her grip on the wheel. "Vengeance belongs to God," she whispered, the familiar words a balm to her troubled spirit. "Not to me." The drive seemed shorter than usual, her mind occupied with thoughts of the meeting ahead. As she pulled into the cafe's parking lot, she spotted Elliot's car already there. He was standing beside it, his tall frame easily recognizable even from a distance. Adama parked her car and stepped out, smoothing her skirt as she walked towards her ex-husband. Despite the years and the pain that had come between them, seeing Elliot still stirred a complex mix of emotions within her. "Adama," Elliot greeted her, his voice warm despite the tension in his shoulders. "It's good to see you." "You too, Elliot," she replied, managing a small smile. "Thank you for waiting." As they turned to enter the cafe, movement caught Adama's eye. Her heart sank as she recognized the hunched figure emerging from a car across the lot. It was her neighbor, the same woman who had been harassing her for weeks. "Elliot," Adama whispered urgently, gripping his arm. "That woman over there, she's the one who's been threatening me. She must have followed me here." Elliot's posture stiffened as he glanced in the direction Adama indicated. "Are you sure?" Adama nodded, her eyes never leaving the old woman. "Positive. What should we do?" "Don't worry," Elliot said, his voice low and reassuring. "We're in a public place and I'm here with you. She's probably just trying to intimidate you. Let's go inside." As they walked towards the cafe entrance, Adama couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. "It's getting worse, Elliot," she confided. "This morning, I found a horrible drawing on my car, a limbless figure over a cauldron. It's like she really sees me as some kind of witch." Elliot's jaw clenched visibly. "Adama, this is exactly why I've been telling you to move. You need to find somewhere safe to live." The words hit Adama like a physical blow, transporting her back to her childhood in Africa. How many times had she heard her father say those exact words as they fled from one village to another, always one step ahead of those who would harm them. "I know," she said softly, unable to meet Elliot's concerned gaze. "I know you're right. It's not as simple as it used to be." As they entered the cafe, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries enveloped them. They found a table in a quiet corner, away from the windows and prying eyes of the old woman. "Adama?" Elliot's voice cut through her reverie. "Are you all right?" He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but never quite making contact. "I know it's been hard, Adama, but we can't let these setbacks pull us away from what truly matters." Adama nodded, straightening in her chair. Elliot was right. They were here for a reason, and she couldn't let her personal troubles overshadow their mission. With a deep breath, she opened the folder she had brought, spreading out the documents before them. "You're right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Let's focus on what matters most, finding our boys." The cafe hummed with the quiet conversations of other patrons, but for Adama and Elliot, the world had narrowed to the documents spread before them on the small table. Each paper, each photograph, represented another thread in the complex tapestry of their search for their missing sons. Adama's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out the latest report. "The most concrete information we have is still that CCTV footage from Tanzania," she said, her voice low and intense. "But the police, they mentioned a call they received around the same time. Someone claimed to have seen one of the boys in Iowa." Elliot's brow furrowed as he leaned in to examine the report. "Iowa? That doesn't make any sense. The distance, the timing, how could they be in two such different places in a matter of weeks?" "I know," Adama sighed, frustration evident in her tone. "The police don't think it's a credible lead either, but we can't afford to ignore anything, can we?" They pored over the documents, rehashing information they had gone over countless times before. Each detail, no matter how small, was scrutinized anew in the desperate hope that something might have been overlooked. As they worked, Elliot's demeanor began to change. His movements became more agitated, his voice taking on an edge of anger. "I just can't understand it," he said, his fist clenching on the table. "How could someone do this? How could that nanny just take our boys?" Adama looked up, seeing the pain etched deeply in Elliot's features. It was a pain she knew all too well, one that had torn their marriage apart in the years following the twins' disappearance. "Charlotte Abioy," Elliot spat the name like a curse. "If I ever see her again, I swear I'll—" "Elliot, please," Adama interjected softly, reaching out to place her hand over his clenched fist. "That kind of thinking, it won't help us find the boys." Elliot's eyes met hers, a storm of emotions swirling in their depths. "How can you be so calm about this, Adama? After everything we've been through." Adama took a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the cross necklace that hung at her throat. "I understand your anger, Elliot. Believe me, I do. For a long time I felt the same way, but recently I've found my way back to God. It's given me a peace I didn't think was possible anymore." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I still worry, of course, but there's a part of me that feels certain. Like I know deep in my soul that we'll find them. It's just a matter of time." Elliot pulled his hand away, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "Bullshit," he muttered, then immediately looked contrite. "I'm sorry, Adama. I didn't mean... It's just... Where was your God when Charlotte took our boys? Where is he now when that neighbor is threatening you?" A heavy silence fell between them. Adama felt the familiar ache in her chest, the pain of loss compounded by the gulf that had grown between her and Elliot. She opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no words that could bridge the chasm of their different ways of coping. Finally, Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice softer now. "I shouldn't have said that. It's just... Sometimes it feels like we're no closer to finding them than we were the day they disappeared." Adama nodded, understanding all too well the despair that could overwhelm them in moments like these. "I know," she said gently. "But we can't give up hope. We have to keep believing, keep searching." As they began to gather up the documents, both acutely aware that they had made no new progress, Adama's gaze drifted to the window. The church across the street caught her eye, its spire reaching towards the sky like a beacon of hope. The afternoon sun glinted off its stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the sidewalk below. "Elliot," she said suddenly, an idea forming. "I missed the morning mass at my usual church because of what happened with the neighbor. Would you like to come with me to the service here? It's starting soon." Elliot looked surprised, his eyes following hers to the church across the street. For a moment, Adama thought he would refuse, but then his expression softened. The lines of anger and frustration seemed to smooth out, replaced by a look of thoughtful consideration. "You know what? Why not?" he said finally. "It's been a while since we've spent time together outside of all this." He gestured to the papers strewn across the table, a rueful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As they stood to leave, Adama felt a glimmer of hope, not just for their search, but for the possibility of healing the rift between them. Perhaps, in the quiet sanctuary of the church, they could find a moment of peace amidst the storm of their ongoing struggle. Together, they stepped out of the cafe and into the bright afternoon sun, the church beckoning them from across the street. Adama offered a silent prayer of thanks for this small moment of connection, even as her heart remained heavy with the weight of their missing sons. As they crossed the street toward the imposing structure, she stole a quick glance over her shoulder. Through the cafe's glass walls, she was relieved to see that the troublesome neighbor was still inside, seemingly unaware of her presence. The old lady's car remained parked in the lot, and Adama let out a small sigh of relief. As they climbed the steps to the church entrance, Adama couldn't help but marvel at the building's grandeur. It was a far cry from the modest chapel she usually attended near her home. The ornate doors swung open silently, welcoming them into a space that seemed to breathe with centuries of faith and devotion. "It's beautiful," Adama whispered. She paused just inside the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimmer light within, her eyes wide as she took in the soaring arches and intricate stained glass windows. Elliot nodded beside her, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "It's been a long time since I've been in a place like this," he admitted softly. His voice echoed slightly in the vast space, and he seemed to shrink into himself, as if suddenly aware of his own smallness in the face of such grandeur. They made their way down the center aisle, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner. The soft murmur of other parishioners created a gentle backdrop, a reminder that they were not alone in this sacred space. Adama felt drawn to a pew near the middle, close to a stunning stained glass window depicting various saints. The figures in the glass seemed to gaze down at them with serene, knowing eyes. The service began with the priest ascending to the pulpit, his presence commanding immediate attention from the congregation. He was an older man, his silver hair catching the light as he moved, his face lined with years of both joy and sorrow. As he began to speak, welcoming the congregation, Adama felt a sense of calm settle over her. The first notes of a hymn filled the air, the organ's deep tones resonating through the church. Adama closed her eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over her. It was a moment of peace she hadn't realized how desperately she needed. Beside her, she could hear Elliot's deep voice joining in the song, hesitant at first but growing stronger. The sound brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since they had shared a moment like this? Suddenly the heavy church doors creaked open, the sound echoing through the vaulted space. Adama's eyes snapped open, her attention drawn to the late arrivals. A man in a crisp suit strode down the center aisle, his steps purposeful and assured. Behind him trailed two young boys, their movements more hesitant, almost mechanical. Instead of slipping quietly into a back pew as most latecomers would, the man led the boys directly to the same row as Adama and Elliot, sitting just across the aisle from them. The disruption was brief, and soon the service continued as if nothing had happened. But Adama found her attention repeatedly drawn to the newcomers, particularly the two boys. There was something about them that tugged at her heart, a familiarity she couldn't quite place. Their skin was pale, almost translucent in the colored light filtering through the stained glass. Their hair, a shock of white blonde, was so similar to her own that it made her breath catch in her throat. As the hymn ended and the congregation settled into their seats, Adama leaned close to Elliot, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those boys," she breathed, her heart racing. "They're albinos like me, and their arms. Elliot, they're missing their arms." Elliot's gaze followed hers, his expression tightening as he took in the sight of the two pale-skinned children. Their empty sleeves hung limply at their sides, a stark and horrifying reminder of the cruelty that existed in the world. "My God," he murmured, his voice a mix of shock and sorrow. "What happened to them?" Adama felt a deep aching sadness settle in her chest. It was a pain that went beyond sympathy, touching on her own experiences and fears. "They must have been rescued," she explained softly, her voice thick with emotion. "In some African communities, albinos are targeted for their body parts, arms, legs. They're believed to hold spiritual power for rituals promising wealth and success." Elliot's face paled at her words, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. That's horrific," he managed, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of shared horror and comfort. "Do you think they were brought here from Africa?" Adama nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the two boys. They sat perfectly still, their faces blank, showing no reaction to the service going on around them. "It's likely," she said. "The bandages on their arms look recent enough. There are still native African communities here, but they wouldn't dare perform such extreme rituals with the law enforcement we have." As they watched, Adama couldn't help but notice the blank expressions on the boys' faces. There was no joy, no curiosity, just a haunting emptiness that spoke volumes about the trauma they must have endured. It was a look she had seen before, in the eyes of other albino children she had met through support groups and outreach programs. But there was something different about these boys, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness. Elliot shifted uncomfortably beside her, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Adama," he said gently, his voice barely audible over the priest's words. "I know you mean well, but it's not polite to stare. That man with them, probably their father, he might not appreciate it." Adama blinked, suddenly aware of how intently she had been watching the newcomers. "You're right," she said, forcing her gaze back to the front of the church. "I'm sorry, I can't help but think about what they must have gone through." As the service continued, Adama tried to focus on the priest's words, on the familiar rhythms of the Mass. But her mind kept drifting back to the two albino boys. Their presence stirred something deep within her, a mixture of compassion, sorrow, and an inexplicable sense of connection. She found herself offering silent prayers, not just for her own missing sons, but for these two strangers as well. Whatever hardships they had endured, whatever cruelties they had faced, Adama hoped they would find healing and peace in their new life. As the service progressed, the familiar rhythms of prayer and response washed over Adama like a comforting tide. Yet, despite her best efforts to focus on the words of the priest, her attention kept drifting back to the two albino boys seated across the aisle. There was something about them, a nagging familiarity that she couldn't quite place, that kept drawing her gaze. The air in the church was heavy with the scent of incense, and the warmth of bodies pressed close in shared devotion. Shafts of colored light from the stained glass windows danced across the congregation as the sun's position shifted, painting the scene in an ever-changing palette of hues. As the priest climbed the pulpit once more, his voice rang out clear and strong, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Before we begin our sermon, let us take a moment to greet those around us. Turn to your neighbors, shake their hands, and welcome them into our community of faith." Adama felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach as she realized this would bring her face to face with the mysterious newcomers. She stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, and turned towards the aisle. Elliot was already shaking hands with the people behind them, his demeanor polite but reserved. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Adama stepped towards the two boys. She extended her hand, offering a warm smile that she hoped would put them at ease. "Peace be with you," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the general murmur of greetings. But the boys didn't respond. They remained seated, their eyes fixed straight ahead, showing no reaction to her greeting. It was as if they were looking through her, their gaze focused on some distant point beyond the confines of the church. The emptiness in their eyes sent a chill down Adama's spine. The man in the suit, who had been shaking hands with someone else, quickly turned his attention to Adama. His movement was swift, almost protective, as he positioned himself slightly in front of the boys. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. There was a hint of an accent that Adama couldn't quite place. "Please excuse the boys, they've had a difficult morning." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Instead, his gaze seemed to assess her, taking in every detail of her appearance. Adama nodded, trying to hide her concern. "Of course, I understand," she replied softly. "We all have our struggles." As soon as the words left her mouth, she saw something change in the man's expression. His eyes widened slightly, scanning her from head to toe as if truly seeing her for the first time. Adama was used to such looks. People often did a double-take when they realized she was albino. But there was something different about this man's gaze. It was calculating, almost predatory, that made her felt exposed, vulnerable. The man extended his hand and Adama took it, expecting a brief, polite handshake. Instead, his grip lingered, his thumb brushing over her skin in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. It was as if he was appraising her, feeling the texture of her skin. His touch was cool and dry, sending an involuntary shiver through her body. Adama felt a chill run down her spine. She gently but firmly pulled her hand away, taking a small step back. I should return to my seat," she murmured, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure others must be able to hear it. As she settled back next to Elliot, she could feel his concerned gaze on her. "Everything okay?" he whispered, leaning in close. Adama tried to steady her breathing to calm the racing of her heart. "I'm not sure," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something off about that man." Elliot's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, the priest called for everyone's attention. The sermon was beginning, his voice rising and falling in the cadence of a well-practiced orator. But for Adama, the words seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the tumult of her thoughts. As the priest's words filled the church, Adama found herself unable to focus. Her mind kept replaying the strange interaction, the unsettling way the man had touched her hand. She glanced across the aisle, studying the two boys more closely. Their hair, though shorter than hers, had a familiar texture, the fine, almost silky strands that were characteristic of albinism. And their ears. Adama's breath caught in her throat. The shape of their ears, with a distinctive pointed tip, was eerily similar to her own. It was a trait she had inherited from her father, one that she had passed on to her own sons. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Could it be possible? After all these years, could these boys possibly be? Elliot noticed her distraction again and whispered very closely into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "I thought you were more serious about religion than this. You keep getting distracted." Adama fumbled in her purse for a pen and a scrap of paper, her hands shaking slightly as she scribbled a note. Careful not to draw attention, she slid the paper to Elliot. "Boys, look at their hairs and ears." Elliot read the note, his eyes widening slightly. He watched the boys too this time, his gaze intense and scrutinizing. After a long moment, he leaned in close again, his voice barely audible. "Nah, I don't think so. It can't be." But Adama couldn't shake the feeling that had taken root in her heart. The similarities were too striking to ignore. The air in the church seemed to grow thicker as the service progressed, the weight of Adama's suspicions pressing down on her like a physical force. She found herself counting the minutes, her attention split between the priest's words and the two silent boys across the aisle. The familiar rituals of the Mass, once a source of comfort, now felt like an obstacle keeping her from the truth she desperately needed to uncover. Finally, a break in the service arrived, the candle ceremony. Adama's heart quickened as she realized this was her chance to get closer to the boys, to confirm or dispel the wild hope that had taken root in her mind. She watched intently as the man in the suit rose, guiding the two boys to join the procession moving towards the front of the church. Without a word to Elliot, Adama stood and quickly maneuvered herself into line directly behind them. The scent of beeswax and incense grew stronger as they approached the altar, where rows of unlit candles waited. The soft murmur of prayers and the rustle of clothing filled the air, creating a backdrop of white noise that seemed to isolate Adama and the boys from the rest of the congregation. The line moved slowly, each person taking a moment to light a candle and offer a silent prayer. Adama's palms were sweating as she inched closer to the boys. When they finally reached the front, she watched intently as they awkwardly took candles with their remaining hands. The sight of their empty sleeves made her heart ache with a mixture of sorrow and anger. Seizing her opportunity, Adama leaned in slightly. "Hi there," she said softly, her voice gentle and warm. She tried to catch their eyes, searching for any sign of recognition or emotion. "I couldn't help but notice your arms. Would you like me to pray for you?" The boys turned to look at her, their blue eyes, so strikingly similar to her own, wide with a mixture of surprise and wariness. For a moment, Adama thought she saw a flicker of something in their gaze. Fear. Longing. But it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. They didn't speak, only shaking their heads slightly in unison. Adama's heart ached at their silence. As they lit their candles and turned to head back to their seats, she found herself unable to let them go. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand reached out, not quite touching them but hovering in the space between. "I'm sorry, but where is your mother?" The words had barely left her mouth when the man in the suit appeared at her side, his presence looming and intimidating. His hand clamped down on her wrist, his grip firm but not quite painful. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his earlier politeness evaporating like morning dew. "Why are you touching my sons?" Adama took a step back, her hands raised in a placating gesture. The candle in her hand wobbled precariously, its flame dancing wildly. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I didn't mean any harm, it's just they look so much like someone from my family." The man's face darkened with anger, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Whoever you think they are, they're not," he snapped. His voice was low but carried an undercurrent of threat that made Adama's skin crawl. Without another word, he grabbed the boys by their shoulders and began to steer them towards the exit, abandoning the service. Adama stood frozen, watching as they disappeared through the heavy church doors. The candle trembled in her hand, hot wax dripping onto her fingers, but she barely noticed the pain. She felt as if she was watching her sons disappear all over again, powerless to stop it. She barely noticed when Elliot appeared at her side, his face creased with concern. "Adama, what happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. That man looked furious. She turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and certainty. "Elliot, when I was close to them, I saw their eyes. They have the same blue eyes as me." Elliot's expression shifted from concern to dawning realization. "You really think, but how could that be possible?" "I don't know," Adama admitted, her voice shaking. She set down her candle, afraid she might drop it. "But something is very wrong here. The way that man reacted." "Elliot, we can't let them leave. We have to find out who they are." For a moment, Elliot hesitated, the rational part of his mind clashing with the hope that had begun to flicker in his heart. Then, with a decisive nod, he took Adama's hand. "Let's go," he said. "We'll follow them. I agree, a good man wouldn't react so aggressively in a place this sacred." Together they hurried out of the church, leaving behind the flickering candles and the murmur of prayers. As they emerged into the bright sunlight of the parking lot, Adama's eyes scanned frantically for any sign of the man and the two boys. There, at the far end of the lot, she spotted them. The man was ushering the boys into a sleek, expensive-looking car, his movements hurried and agitated. Without a word, Adama and Elliot began to move towards them, their hearts pounding in unison with each step. As they drew closer, they could hear the man's voice, low and urgent, speaking to the boys. But before they could make out his words, he looked up, his eyes locking with Adama's. In that moment, she saw a flash of something in his gaze, fear, guilt, or perhaps a mixture of both. "Hey!" Elliot called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We need to talk to you, those boys—" But the man was already moving, practically shoving the boys into the back seat before jumping behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, the sound shattering the peaceful Sunday afternoon. Before Adama and Elliot could close the distance, the car was peeling out of the parking lot, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning rubber and a cloud of dust. Adama and Elliot stood there, breathless and stunned, watching as the car disappeared around a corner. The silence that fell between them was heavy with unspoken questions and a renewed sense of urgency. Finally, Elliot turned to Adama, his face set with determination. "We need to call the police," he said. "Whatever's going on here, it's not right, those boys. If there's even a chance they could be—" Adama nodded, her hand already reaching for her phone. As she dialed the number for Detective Harold Grant, the officer who had been assigned to their case all those years ago, she sent up a silent prayer. After so many years of searching, of hoping against hope, could this finally be the breakthrough they had been waiting for? The tension in the air was palpable as Adama and Elliot stood in the church parking lot, their eyes fixed on the spot where the mysterious car had disappeared. The peaceful Sunday afternoon had been shattered, replaced by a sense of urgency and barely contained panic. Adama's fingers trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear, waiting for Detective Harold Grant to answer. The ringtone seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. Adama's free hand found Elliot's, gripping it tightly. His palm was sweaty against hers, betraying his own nervousness despite his outward calm. Finally, a gruff voice answered, "Detective Grant speaking." "Detective," Adama said, her voice shaking slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "This is Adama Keita. We think we may have seen our boys." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "Mrs. Keita," Detective Grant said, his tone a mixture of sympathy and weariness. "We've been through this before. I know you're always on the lookout, but—" "No, you don't understand," Adama interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "This is different. We saw them. In a church. 2 albino boys, just like our sons, and their arms were missing. They were with a man, and he said he was their father." The detective's tone sharpened. "Mrs. Keita, I understand you're desperate for any lead, but this doesn't seem plausible. The last verified sighting of your sons was on CCTV in Tanzania. It's highly unlikely they would suddenly appear here." Adama felt her heart sink, but she refused to give up. "Please, Detective Grant," she pleaded. "There's always a possibility in cases like this. You have to take this seriously." The detective sighed, a sound heavy with years of dealing with desperate parents and dead-end leads. "Did you get the car's license plate? Any idea where they might be going?" Adama's silence was answer enough. She could almost hear the detective's shoulders slumping on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Keita," he said, "but without more concrete information, there's not much I can do. I'll make a note in the system logs, but—" He trailed off, leaving the futility of the situation hanging in the air between them. As Adama ended the call, she turned to Elliot, her expression a mixture of determination and despair. "We're on our own," she said softly. "We'll have to find out ourselves." Elliot nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "Let's start with the church," he suggested. "Maybe someone there knows something about that man and the boys." They made their way back into the church, where the last stragglers from the service were shaking hands with the pastor near the entrance. Adama and Elliot waited patiently, watching as the congregation slowly filtered out, leaving them alone with the kindly-looking man in clerical robes. As the last parishioner left, Adama and Elliot approached the pastor, who turned to them with a warm smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice rich and comforting. "I don't believe I've seen you here before. I'm Pastor Samuel Dodd." Adama and Elliot introduced themselves, then hesitated, unsure how to broach the subject of the mysterious man and the albino boys. Finally, Adama took a deep breath and asked, "Pastor Dodd, The man in suit who was here earlier with 2 albino boys. Do you know who he is?" The pastor's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't give out information about our parishioners to strangers, especially when I've never seen you in our church before." He studied them for a moment before adding, "But if you're hoping to speak with him, he does come here often with the boys. Just be here around this time and you might get your chance." Adama's heart sank, but she pressed on. "Please, it's important. We don't have time to wait. Those boys—" She fumbled in her purse, pulling out a worn photograph of 2 smiling albino toddlers. "They might be our sons." And Pastor Dodd's eyes widened as he looked at the photograph, then back at Adama and Elliot. For a long moment he seemed to be wrestling with himself. Finally he sighed. "The man you're asking about is named Stephen Harper," he said quietly. "He's a major donor to our church, well respected in this part of town. He often attends services with those boys." Adama felt a surge of hope. "Do you know where he lives?" she asked eagerly. But the pastor shook his head. "I'm sorry, but that's all the information I can give you. I hope you understand." As they left the church, Adama and Elliot felt a mixture of frustration and determination. They had a name now, Stephen Harper, but it still felt like they were grasping at straws. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Adama and Elliot made their way back to their car. The cafe where they had parked earlier was still open, the smell of coffee and pastries wafting out onto the street. Adama's eyes scanned the area, a habit born from years of watchfulness, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized the troubling neighbor's car was nowhere to be seen. Elliot placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come on," he said softly. "I'll drive. We'll figure this out together." Adama nodded, climbing into the passenger seat of Elliot's car. As soon as the doors closed, she pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she searched for information on Stephen Harper. The car hummed to life, and as Elliot pulled out of the parking lot, Adama's voice broke the tense silence. "He's a wealthy businessman," she said, her eyes never leaving the phone screen. "But there's not much public information about him, just a well-crafted profile and website." Elliot nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Keep looking," he encouraged. "There has to be something we can use." The minutes ticked by, filled only with the sound of Adama's fingers tapping on her phone and the soft hum of the car's engine. Just as Elliot was about to suggest they regroup and come up with a new plan, Adama let out a small gasp. "I found an address," she said, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "It's in Ladue, not far from here." Elliot glanced at the address on Adama's phone, a determined look settling over his features. "That's only about 20 minutes away," he said. "We should check it out." The drive seemed to stretch on forever, each mile bringing them closer to what they hoped would be answers, but also to the possibility of crushing disappointment. Adama's mind raced with possibilities. What if the boys they saw weren't their sons? What if they were, but they didn't remember their parents? What if this was all a terrible mistake? As they approached the address, the suburban landscape gave way to more expansive properties. Finally, they turned onto a tree-lined drive that led to an imposing villa. Elliot parked the car a short distance away, and they both sat for a moment, gathering their courage. "Ready?" Elliot asked softly, reaching over to squeeze Adama's hand. She nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. Together they stepped out of the car and approached the property. The gate stood open, and as they cautiously made their way up the driveway, they spotted a familiar figure, Stephen Harper, still in his suit from church, standing next to a luxury car. Beside him was one of the albino boys, his empty sleeve a stark reminder of the horrors he had endured. Adama's heart leapt into her throat. She tugged on Elliot's arm, and they quickly ducked behind some ornamental bushes at the edge of the vast, manicured lawn. From their hiding spot, they watched as another expensive car pulled into the driveway. A well-dressed man emerged from the new arrival, an envelope in his hand. Words were exchanged, too low for Adama and Elliot to hear, but the intent was clear as Stephen Harper moved the boy into the newcomer's car. Adama felt as if her world was collapsing. Without thinking, she burst from their hiding place, ignoring Elliot's desperate grab at her arm. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice echoing across the lawn. Stephen Harper's head snapped up, his face contorting with anger and fear as he recognized them. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snarled, stepping protectively in front of the boy. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The other man looked alarmed, his eyes darting between Stephen, Adama, and Elliot. Adama barely noticed him, her attention focused solely on the small, pale figure standing silently inside the car. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "That boy, he might be my son. Please just let us talk to him." Stephen's face hardened. "I'm calling the police," he threatened, reaching for his phone. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll have you arrested for stalking and trespassing." Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil evident in his eyes. "That won't be necessary," he said, pulling out his own phone. "I'm calling the police myself." As Elliot dialed Detective Grunt's number, explaining the situation to him, Adama kept her eyes fixed on the boy. Now, under this new light, the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of his ears, the particular shade of his eyes. It was like looking at a ghost of her lost child. "This must be our missing son, Ibrahim or Amari," she said softly, the words feeling right as they left her mouth. She turned to Stephen, her voice gaining strength. "We know who you are, Mr. Harper. Your reputation in the community, the police are on their way. Please just tell us the truth." Stephen's composure cracked, fear seeping through the cracks in his angry facade. The other man, still standing by his car, suddenly spoke up. "I'm sorry, but this is too risky. The deal is off." He turned to the boy, gesturing urgently. "Get out of the car, quickly." Elliot reacted instantly, lunging forward to grab the car's handle. He wrenched the door open, gently but firmly, helping the boy out before Stephen could intervene. Stephen's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I'll sue you for attempted kidnapping." The other man was already reversing, clearly intent on fleeing the scene. But before he could make it to the gate, 2 police cars pulled up, blocking the exit. The wail of sirens filled the air as more backup arrived. Detective Grant emerged from one of the cars, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before him. "Everyone stay where you are," he commanded, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. "Hands where I can see them." As the officers approached, Detective Grant turned to Elliot. "Explain what's going on here." Elliot, his arm protectively around the silent boy, quickly recounted their suspicions and what they had witnessed. Adama added her own observations, her voice shaking as she described the similarities between this boy and their missing sons. Detective Grant listened intently, then turned to Stephen and the other man. "Your turn," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "What's your side of this story?" Stephen, his earlier bravado evaporating under the detective's stern gaze, attempted to bluster his way through. "This is all a misunderstanding," he insisted. "These are my children. This couple is trying to frame me." The detective's eyebrow raised skeptically. He turned to the other man, who was fidgeting nervously by his car. "And you? What's your role in all this?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Stephen and the officers. "My name is Luca Carhold," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a driver. I was supposed to pick up the boy and take him to a clinic. For his arm, you know." Detective Grant's eyes narrowed. It was clear he didn't believe a word of it. He turned back to the boy, his voice softening as he knelt to the child's eye level. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. "Did these men take care of you?" The boy remained silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point, seemingly unaware of the chaos around him. The detective's frown deepened. He stood, gesturing to his officers. "Search the house," he ordered, "and find the other boy." Turning back to Stephen and Luca, his voice hardened. "I'm going to give you one chance to come clean," he said. "If we find any evidence of harm to these children, and believe me, we will find it, you'll be facing life in prison. No amount of money or influence will save you, understand?" The threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Luca broke. His composure crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a wave. His shoulders slumped, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm just a driver," he repeated, but this time the words were laced with desperation. "I was hired to pick up the boy and deliver him to the port. There's a ship waiting there." Detective Grant's eyes narrowed. "What ship? Where exactly?" Luca shook his head, fear evident in every line of his body. "The port of St. Louis, but I don't know all the details exactly. They keep us in the dark. I've only heard things. Whispers from the other staff. How the people who own the ship, they're rich and powerful. There's some kind of hospital inside where they operate on children." His voice broke on the last words, horror seeping through. "But those are just rumors I heard. I never really believed them. I thought it's just a hospital." The detective's face hardened. "Operations? What kind of operations?" Luca's eyes darted to the boy's missing arm, then quickly away. "I don't know exactly, but I've seen medical workers going in and out of the ship. The rumor said they operate in international waters, but I don't know, I swear." Detective Grant turned to Stephen, his expression a mixture of disgust and determination. "Your turn," he said. "If you cooperate, maybe we can put in a few good word for you." The lie was smooth, a tactic used countless times to extract confessions. Stephen's facade finally cracked. All right, he said, his voice shaking. "I'll tell you everything. But you have to understand, I'm just a small part of this. The real monster is Astor Schatz, the man who owns the ship." As Stephen poured out his story, Adama felt her world shift beneath her. She listened in horror as he revealed how he had purchased the boys from a slave trader in Tanzania, admitting to years of trafficking children, selling them to Astor for his vile operations, and reselling them on the black market. "The boys' arms were already gone when I got them," Stephen said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The merchant said they were caught by villagers in Tanzania while trying to escape. I still bought them because even without limbs, albino body parts fetch a high price." Elliot's face contorted with rage. "You monster," he spat. "You treat children like commodities." Detective Grant held up a hand, silencing Elliot. "How did the boys end up in Tanzania?" he asked. "If they're really the Cater's sons, they were born here in St. Louis." Stephen shrugged. "The merchant said he got them from some rich family in the US. They've been passed around, sold and resold. I didn't ask questions. I just brought them here to Clayton, kept them at the house until Astor's ship was ready for the next batch." As the full horror of the situation sank in, Detective Grant turned to Adama and Elliot. His voice was gentle but firm. "If this is true, it means the nanny who took your boys sold them into this nightmare. For them to end up back here, it's beyond coincidence. Some might call it fate or divine intervention." Adama nodded, tears streaming down her face. Her faith, which had sustained her through years of searching, now felt both vindicated and tested beyond measure. As backup officers swarmed the property, searching the house and questioning the staff, Adama and Elliot stood in stunned silence. The magnitude of what they had uncovered was almost too much to comprehend. Stephen's confession continued, each word driving home the horror of what their sons had endured. "The merchant told me to take them to church," he said, his voice hollow. "Said they were used to religious settings, that it would keep them calm. I didn't question it." Elliot's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body rigid with suppressed rage. "You took them to church," he spat. "You paraded our mutilated, traumatized children in front of God, pretending to be a caring father." Detective Grant placed a calming hand on Elliot's shoulder. "I know this is difficult," he said softly, "but we need to stay focused. Every detail could be crucial in dismantling this operation and finding other victims." Adama, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. Her voice was quiet but filled with a strength born from years of hope and suffering. "I understand," she said, her eyes never leaving the silent boy standing nearby. "I lived through similar horrors in Africa, the fear, the constant threat, but I had my family. Our boys only had each other." The detective nodded solemnly. Mrs. Cater, I've seen cases like this before. Albinos targeted for trafficking, their body parts sold for rituals. But this international operation, it's on another level. As they spoke, a commotion near the house drew their attention. Officers were leading out another small, pale figure, the second boy. Adama's heart leapt into her throat as the two children were reunited. They embraced awkwardly with their remaining arms, their faces showing the first flicker of emotion since their discovery. A social worker arrived on the scene, introducing himself before approaching the boys. His attempts to engage them were met with silence, their eyes remaining distant and unfocused. Turning to Adama and Elliot, the social worker's face was grave. "This won't be easy," he said gently. "They're deeply traumatized, likely brainwashed. But there's hope. With time, therapy, and love, healing is possible. I'll arrange for a child psychiatrist to work with them." Adama nodded, tears streaming down her face. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, there was a path forward. As the police prepared to transport everyone to the station for formal statements, Elliot turned to Adama. "If you hadn't insisted on going to that church today," he said softly, "we might never have found them. You never gave up hope." The flashing lights of police cars painted the twilight in shades of red and blue as the group prepared to leave for the station. Adama, emotionally and physically exhausted, leaned against Elliot for support as they walked towards a waiting police car. Suddenly, a familiar face at the gate caught Adama's eye. Her heart rate spiked as she recognized her troublesome neighbor, Madeline Tareya, standing there with a look of shock on her aged face. "Detective Grant," Adama called out, her voice tight, "could you come here for a moment?" As the detective approached, Adama pointed out the old woman. "That's my neighbor," she explained, "the one who's been harassing and stalking me all day. She must have followed us here." Detective Grant's eyes narrowed as he took in the situation. Together they approached Madeline, who seemed to shrink under their gaze. "Ma'am," the detective said firmly, "I need you to explain why you're here and why you've been following Mrs. Cater." Madeline fell silent for a long moment, her eyes shifting nervously between Adama and the detective. When she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My name is Madeline Tareya. And I'm so sorry. I didn't know until I heard this just now, and I'm sorry for eavesdropping and stalking you." Tears welled up in the old woman's eyes as she continued, "My parents always told me albinos were demonic, sent to bring trouble and plague to the community. I believed them, even into my old age now. But hearing everything just now, I had no idea how hard things were for you." Adama felt a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Anger, pity, a weary sort of understanding. "How could anyone think we're so different?" she asked, her voice cracking. "We're human beings just trying to navigate this complicated world. We have feelings, hopes, dreams. We're not just vessels for some mystical force." Madeline nodded, shame evident in every line of her face. "You're right," she admitted. "I was blinded by prejudice and ignorance, and because of that I saw something, years ago, but I didn't say anything." Adama's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "The night your boys disappeared," Madeline said, her voice heavy with regret. "I saw the nanny taking them out of the house. It seemed odd, but I didn't want to get involved. I didn't care enough to stop her." Detective Grant stepped forward, his expression intense. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come to the station and make a formal statement. This could be crucial in tracking down the nanny and other members of this trafficking ring." As Madeline nodded her agreement and was led back to her car with a police supervision, Adama felt a strange sense of closure. The neighbor who had caused her so much stress had, in a twisted way, become the key to unlocking the full truth of what happened to her sons. Climbing into the back of a police car with Elliot, Adama found herself reflecting on the events of the day. How quickly everything had changed, how a simple decision to attend a different church had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment. "It's amazing," she said softly to Elliot, "how prejudice and preconceptions can blind people to the humanity of others, but also how, when those blinders come off, Healing and understanding can begin. Elliot nodded, taking her hand in his. "We have a long road ahead," he said, his voice a mixture of determination and tenderness. "But we're in this together. We'll get the boys the best care possible, and we'll start rebuilding our family from the ground up." As the police car pulled away, heading towards the station and the next chapter of their lives, Adama felt a surge of hope. The journey would be difficult, the healing slow and painful, but for the first time in years, she could see a future where her family was whole again. The sun had set completely now, the night sky a canvas of stars above them. As they drove through the quiet streets, Adama offered up a silent prayer of thanks, for the chance to hold her sons again, for the opportunity to help them heal, and for the reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and love could light the way forward.